All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Destry Edwards, multimedia production and studio manager here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, my co-producer on this podcast, and the director, most importantly, of the excellent new documentary film, Dear Mr. President, The Letters of Julia Sand. Welcome to Free the Economy, Destry.
Thank you, Richard. It's different to be on this side of the cameras for your podcast. Usually
Yes.
I'm behind the computer for this.
So this new documentary is fantastic. I saw it, and with a select group of VIPs recently. The Letters of Julia Sand. Let's start out with maybe an obvious question. Who was Julia Sand?
Julia Sand was a woman who lived in the late 1800s. At the time of the story we're talking about, she was about 31 years old. She was the youngest of 8 children of Christian and Isabella Sand. Christian Sand was a immigrant from Germany, and his wife was born in the U.S., and they lived in New York City. By this time, the father had passed away, but Julia was living with her brother. She was fairly ill. We don't know all the details of exactly what she had, but she was not able to do a lot of things physically, but she cared a lot about politics and cared about what was going on in her government at that time.
All right. So, like I said, I was excited to be in the audience. We had this film premiere recently at the Miracle Theater here in Washington, D.C. It's around Capitol Hill, if you all know D.C. And so the specific topic of this film, the series of letters between Julia Sand, this sort of kind of self-educated, kind of very unusual woman from the second half of the 19th century. You know, she corresponded with President Chester A. Arthur in the era after the Civil War. For a lot of people, I'm sure, even sort of American history nerds like myself, this may be kind of an obscure episode in American history. So even though, having seen the film, I know it's treated in a fascinating way, for a topic like this, what was it that brought you to this topic? What made it sort of fascinating enough to want to do this big project?
Yeah, so I first heard about the story in 2018 just from a friend of mine, and I just knew the very basics of the fact that this happened. It's like, oh, this is interesting. Wasn't too far beyond that. And then somewhere around 2.5 years ago, I was working on an explainer video for FreedomWorks, where I worked at the time, where I was doing a explainer video on the rise of the bureaucratic state, which kind of followed through the flow of how government jobs worked over time and the spoil system and all these things. And so as I was doing research for this video, it came across how the spoil system effectively started to come to an end through Chester Arthur and the Pendleton Act. And doing that research brought up again the story of Julia Sand, and just was reintroduced to this, was really fascinated with the story. As I dug into it more, it just became more and more dramatic. I mean, this story about one of our few assassinated presidents being killed by a man who wanted the government job, and shot Garfield, said, now Arthur will be president, because Arthur is the kind of guy he expected would give him a job. I mean, this is just incredibly dramatic, and no one really knows much about the story. And that story was beyond the scope of what that particular video was. Right. But as I was doing more research on it, I was like, if I ever come across the opportunity to tell this story, I want to be able to do that. And eventually that opportunity came.
That's great. Now, you know, the idea of wanting government officials to be competent and not just recipients of, you know, political patronage, I think is a fairly common notion these days. But expecting that was actually sort of controversial in a lot of 19th century America. So you sort of hinted already at the underlying drama here, which a lot of, again, if people are students of American history, they've probably heard of President Garfield being assassinated. But sort of take us back into what was the system like in the 1870s and sort of post-Civil War America, and then leading up to that big dramatic event.
Sure. Well, going back really even further than that, as the government started under the Constitution, ultimately you needed people working for the government to make the government run. And that took some different forms. It was under Andrew Jackson who kind of solidified the concept of the spoil system, the concept of to the victor goes the spoils, also known as the patronage system, where whoever comes into office the people that helped them get elected, the people who were associated with those people, they all get government jobs as the spoils of war, the spoils of the election. Doesn't really matter if you're qualified for it or not, but the fact that you were loyal, the fact that you showed support for the winners, you get a job. Congratulations. You get a paycheck. And after the Civil War, the Republican Party had a strong hold on the federal government. You had between James Buchanan in 1856 and Grover Cleveland in 1884, you had no elected Democratic presidents in between those times. And so the Republicans had a very strong control of the federal government. And so the Republican Party became the place to go, or really, if you wanted a government job. And again, same as it was under Jackson and before, that's just how it worked. That's how the government was staffed. No one really thought that certainly the people who supported that system didn't think that there was really another way that would really work.
And so this was such a sort of ingrained part of people's understanding of how the government worked that you even had this individual who was so obsessed with the idea that he deserved a job, he was willing to shoot the incumbent president at the time. Now, he may have been a little unhinged and be taking things obviously far too far, but the assumption that being part of a certain political party entitled you to a political patronage job was sort of just baked into the cake. So how did that exact, I guess, or that particular instance play out?
Yeah, so Charles Guiteau, he was a man who didn't exactly have a great resume. He had tried several different jobs. He tried to be a preacher. He had tried to be a lawyer. He had tried to be in politics. He'd actually been a cult for a while as well. And honestly, if he had tried to get a low government job, as many people in the system did, he might have been able to get that potentially. But he wanted something bigger. He wanted to be the ambassador to France or the ambassador to Austria. And they don't give those jobs to people like him. He went to the White House several times trying to get this job. He talked to Garfield for a while. He talked to Secretary of State James Blaine, and it became clear to him that they were not willing to give him a job. So in his mind, he needed to be able to save both the country and the Republican Party by killing Garfield and allowing Arthur and the pro-spoils wing of the party take power.
And just to be clear, even today, when a new president comes in, a new administration comes in, you certainly expect the president to appoint their most senior advisors, right? Sure. Those people who are sort of cabinet secretaries and things like that. Anyone who is elected president is expected to have their senior advisors agree with them and probably be of the same party. But we're, of course, talking about all government jobs were like that. Yeah. So that even the person who was, they were like the tax collectors or the postmasters or the people who today we wouldn't consider to be political at all, those people would either get swept out when their guy lost an election, or they would get hired when someone new came in.
And even today with those appointed positions, cabinet secretaries are an obvious example. We still, even though those are appointed by the president, we expect those people coming in to have some level of competence in the role that they're doing. Now, you can argue sometimes whether or not they do under different administrations, but there's at least an expectation of that, where there wasn't even an expectation of that for many jobs in the government at the time.
Mm-hmm. So when Guiteau assassinated President Garfield, he had an assumption that the vice president, Chester A. Arthur, would be sympathetic to his cause. And I think that's one of the most interesting kind of dramatic points of this whole story, is that he had good reason to think that, which makes the sort of later story, what Arthur ends up doing in his presidency, all the more compelling. Tell us about what was the sort of background of Vice President Chester A. Arthur? What was his reputation among his fellows?
So Arthur is a guy who had been in politics for a long time. He had been part of the Whig Party before the Civil War. His father had been a preacher and had been very adamantly anti-slavery. And while Arthur didn't necessarily pick up the religious side of his father, he did pick up that anti-slavery part. So he was, while many people may have been in the Republican Party because of the ability to get these jobs, Arthur seriously did believe in the tenets of the Republican Party. And he was on the ground floor when the Republican Party started. He helped found the New York Republican Party. But in his time in politics after the Civil War, he was able to get connected with the Republican political machine, which later in the 1870s was run by Roscoe Conkling, and he was a top lieutenant for that politician who was a senator from New York, and really got ingrained into that system of government jobs and was ultimately given under President Grant the position of the collector of the Port of New York, which was really the most prestigious patronage job you could get because so much of the country's revenue came through the Port of New York at that time. And so in that position, he was also in charge of handing out lots of these jobs. So he was in a prime position to really set up the system where he gave out the jobs to the people who had been loyal to the party. And he was kind of, in some ways, one of the masterminds of making sure that system ran the way that it was intended to.
So he was really a creature of the patronage system as much as anyone.
100%.
And so when he is unexpectedly thrust into the limelight, and of course back in the late 19th century, being vice president was even less of a job than it is now. Vice presidents were often, despite being, as they say, one heartbeat away from the presidency, they're often fairly obscure figures and didn't all that have much to do. When Garfield was shot, and you make the point in the film that he was not immediately killed, so there was this sort of kind of heart-wrenching days and weeks that happened when it wasn't sure if he would survive or not. People in public life had some time to reflect on, well, what will happen if Chester A. Arthur becomes president? What did most people think about that possibility?
Well, as you say, most people don't know who the vice presidents are, certainly back then. I mean, even as someone who is very interested in American history and presidential history, I couldn't name most of the vice presidents in the 1800s. And it was kind of the same way then as well, and honestly. The vice president was very much an afterthought. He was put on the ticket because of the New York machine. They needed to be able to win New York. So your average person in the U.S. didn't really know anything about Chester Arthur, didn't have a reason to care anything about Chester Arthur. He had no power as vice president. And so after Garfield is shot, and Guiteau says there at the train station that I'm a stalwart and Arthur will be president, all of a sudden you have this spotlight shown on Arthur through that lens of what Guiteau said and recognizing, oh, here's this connection, not between them actually conspiring, even though that was something that was questioned, but just the fact that their goals as stalwarts were aligned in some ways as to what they wanted the government to look like.
Right, that was a particular faction of the Republican
Correct.
Party called
Yes.
the Stalwarts. Yeah.
And so that definitely made the American people question Arthur, made them very suspicious of him, and did not make him a popular figure coming into the White House.
But even people who knew him well probably would not have thought that he was presidential material.
No. I mean, even Arthur did not think he was presidential material. He wanted to be vice president because of the ceremonial aspect of it. It was going to be a great honor to him, but he had no desire to be president. That was not something he was aiming for. And honestly, at that time, most vice presidents didn't become president, so that wasn't something that was on his radar. It was not a springboard to the presidency as people sometimes see it now.
And so he's in this position where his predecessor has been shot, the nation is in crisis, there's not a lot of confidence in his ability to carry out the responsibilities of president, and this is the moment where he gets his first letter from this sort of extraordinary young woman in New York City, Julia Sand. What was that like?
Yeah, so he just gets this letter from Julia. They had never met. They're both New Yorkers, but they'd never met each other. She just sends him this letter, and the first part of the letter can be pretty harsh. I mean, she says early on that the people are bowed in grief, but do you realize it? Not so much because he is dying, it's because you are his successor. I mean, that's kind of a gut punch for anyone who's reading that. And she goes on for a while, like, she's basically saying, let me emphasize how much the people of America don't trust you and don't have confidence in you. She makes that point very clear. But then she goes on to say, but you can do better. And I believe you can do better. And here's things you can do. Here's some encouragement. She tells him to rise to the emergency, to disappoint our fears, and to force the nation to have faith in him. And so, she's harsh. She's tough with being honest about here's where the situation we're in, but also encouragement as to you can rise above this and you can be the president that we need.
Right. And so Julia obviously had a lot of education about public affairs of the day. She was kind of a political junkie in the way that maybe some people who listen to a lot of podcasts are. But she didn't have a career in politics. It wasn't really possible for women, other than being the wife of a prominent politician, to have a high profile in the world of politics. And of course, Julia herself was not married. And you know, she even describes as being the youngest of several children, almost like being the runt of the litter, where people, you know, treat her like a kid. So, you know, I wonder if we can sort of put ourselves in the mind of someone like Arthur. He's in a sort of emotionally vulnerable place, right? Because he's had a big shakeup, and he's not even sure he himself whether, you know, he's not sure himself whether he is going to be a decent president or not in this moment of crisis. And he gets this very sort of curious and unexpected letter from this woman he's never met. You know, what do you think could he possibly been thinking about that?
I mean, Arthur was a very private person, and at that point, his wife had passed away a couple of years before. He had 2 children, but they were, you know, young children. His friends were the people in the machine, and they were people that in this moment where the spotlight is on the machine and criticism of him for being part of it, it's kind of hard to go to them for encouragement on an issue like this. And so he was kind of isolated. And so I think that him being in this isolated spot made him very open to the kind of encouragement and influence that she was bringing to him.
So Julia writes to the new president. Of course, eventually Garfield does die, and Arthur does become president, and you know, encourages him to live up to, you know, the best possible aspects of his nature. And he faces a sort of series of challenges and political negotiations. Now, the biggest of those is, as we were talking about, civil service reform and having protections for people who are in jobs so they don't get fired when politicians change roles, or so that there is an expectation that they are competent when they're hired. But there were some other things as well. What I know, one thing that was in their correspondence, which there was some drama about, was the immigration and the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah, so that's, I think it's fair to say, the blackest mark on Arthur's record as president. So there was pressure from some in the country to ban Chinese immigration and
the ability of people from China to become citizens eventually.
Yes. And so these restrictions came up in a bill through Congress that they passed. And Julia Sand was very against this bill and strongly encouraged Arthur to veto this bill. And he did veto it, and he spoke out that he believed that this was wrong and believed that the Chinese immigrants were a benefit to America. But then Congress did a second version of the bill that watered things down, made it 10 years instead of 20 for the ban, and then basically halved all the restrictions in the bill and passed Congress with even greater margins than the first one. And Arthur recognized that this would be if he vetoed this one, it would be overridden. And so he decided that he wasn't going to veto this one. And so the bill passed, and Julia Sand was very upset with this and actually decided for a while after this letter that she was not going to write to him anymore. That's how upset she was. She eventually changed her mind after some later actions he took, but this is one that definitely had a negative effect on her opinion of him, as well as, again, his most negative action, I would say, as president.
Right. So, I mean, it's interesting how a 19th century president would have looked at an issue like that. But it is also interesting to think that, as you said, Arthur served in the Civil War, and he had come from a staunch abolitionist background. And so the question of personhood, ethnicity, fair treatment under the law, is definitely something that would have been like part of his own legacy of thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was definitely maybe not the strongest we've ever had, certainly, but for the time, he was certainly a strong civil rights president for the 1800s.
Mm-hmm. And, there was a lot of cynicism at the time, of course, about how self-interested political leaders are, how self-interested government officials and bureaucrats are. And, I think in some ways, of course, that cynicism is still with us. People talk about the deep state, things like that. Even though we've had sort of many cycles of civil service law and reform and regulation, the idea that there, even in current, say, public opinion polling, there is a lot of cynicism about government officials and whether they have our best interests at heart. Do you think that in some ways that hasn't changed that much? Do you think that's sort of disappointing, a disappointing aspect of American society, or do you think maybe it's a positive thing that we always need to be to hold politicians' feet to the fire, and we shouldn't get complacent about just assuming that they have our interests at heart?
So I think back to the James Madison quote about how if men were angels, we wouldn't even need government. Mm. And so I think it's really just being rational to recognize that politicians and people in government are not going to be perfect, and they're going to be, to various levels, self-interested. They're going to be human. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's rational to recognize that and expect that, and to have checks on them, to have guide rails for them. Mm-hmm. If that turns into, well, that means that we can never do anything, there's no point in even trying to be involved, I think that can lead to a negative place, and that could lead to a place that's not helpful. Mm-hmm. But I think the idea of keeping our politicians and our government people accountable, I think that's a good thing for us to be doing.
Right. And so the real big event that we're often look back to now on Arthur's presidency was the eventual, as we've all been sort of hinting at, passage of major civil service legislation, what ended up being called the Pendleton Act, that took on a lot of what we're talking about, expecting government employees to be competent, to have qualifications, and not just be given their positions because they know someone who is in a political party. I imagine Julia must have been pretty excited when that happened.
So we assume so. Strangely enough, so her primary correspondence or her writing to Arthur was during his first year. And so she didn't really actually say a lot about when the bill actually passed. Mm-hmm. And we don't know all the reasons for that. We think it does look like from her latest letters that her health declined significantly, mm-hmm. and that kind of took her away from some of this. But going off of what she said in her earlier letters, certainly civil service was one of the biggest issues she was pushing for, one of the biggest, really. And so I imagine that she was happy with how that turned out. But as to having that in writing, we don't really have that.
Mm-hmm. But that would also have been true of the wider public in general. This would have been one of the top political topics at the time.
Yeah, it certainly had growing support, particularly after Garfield's assassination. Mm-hmm. The Republicans got a big hit during the 1882 election cycle because they weren't supporting civil service reform in the numbers that the public was. Mm-hmm. And so that was something Arthur, who was already supporting civil service reform by that point, he was able to leverage that in order to pass the Pendleton Act, which was actually written by a Democrat. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned before, the Republicans had strong control of patronage because they had control of the federal government basically at that point. And so the civil service reform was more popular, broadly speaking, among Democrats. Mm-hmm. And, we can't really say that's because the Democrats were more noble. It's because they were the ones who didn't have the power to begin with. So we might as well reform it to where the other side doesn't have as much of the power. Right. And then when Grover Cleveland became president, he was a reformer and didn't believe in the patronage system. So the Democrats didn't really have that system in play when he came in either.
Mm-hmm. So this series of letters between Julius Sand and President Arthur, and the first was before he actually became president, but What happened after the presidency of Arthur, and how did these sort of unusual artifacts come down to us today? Because again, it's a sort of episode that's not mentioned in a lot of big, serious histories of the United States. So how do we even know about it now?
Yeah, so Chester Arthur had the second shortest post-presidency of any president in American history. He only lived for a year or so after he left office. And before his death, he had the majority of his documents burned. But among the around 1,800 documents that he kept, that included the 23 letters from Julia Sand. He put them all into an envelope. He marked with his own handwriting her initials that she'd used to sign the letters, and left that as property to his son. And his son apparently didn't have that much interest in the documents, but his grandson did. And his grandson, later on in the 1930s, I think it was, started reviewing the documents and came across those letters and was fascinated by what was written to his grandfather all those years ago. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how these letters were rediscovered. The first Arthur biography, which there are not many of, but the very first one was written without knowledge of these letters.
And so today the letters are part of the Smithsonian collection, is that right?
Library of Congress.
The Library of Congress, right. So you, if you are interested in reading them, you can see them online. They're scanned. They've been transcribed, and I think Julia's own story is very interesting. So after Arthur leaves the presidency, he was fairly ill, though the public didn't really know that when his term ended, and he died not long after. Julia actually lived many decades after that, but also suffered from ill health, and some, again, it's not entirely clear, some either it's a chronic disease or a long-term disability that kept her from living what would probably be a fuller life than she otherwise would have. But we don't know that she wrote any more letters to national political figures, but she did write for publication in her adult lifetime in other places, and was sort of very kind of active certainly for again a woman, being interested in politics and public affairs in her time. And I noticed recently that the New York Times obituary section has this feature where they go back and publish obituaries sort of in the past several years of people who would not have been noticed at the time maybe, or considered more important today. And they published a sort of ex post facto, many decades later, obituary of Julia Sand after she died in, I believe, 1933. So it's interesting that whether it's the currents of history or fate sort of brought these two people together for a relatively brief period of time. Julia sending these letters, and the president reading them. We know that he read them, but after that, not long after the major events of Arthur's presidency, they neither of them ends up actually having that much of a public impact.
Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly the impact is there in how the government changed in the time.
Right.
And also Arthur did things to build up the Navy as well that kind of prepared things for the 20th century. But yeah, as to them being known, Chester Arthur is consistently ranked as one of the least known presidents in our history, and Julia Sand is even less known than him. Mm-hmm. And she's so close to her not being known at all. If Arthur had just happened to include those among if he put that envelope along with the other things to be burned, we would never have known about her connection, because her family also, once she died, her family burned the rest of her papers and belongings, which was just 2-3 years or so before Chester Arthur III reached out to the family to find out more about her and confirm with him, like, oh yeah, Arthur had come to visit the house and everything. Mm-hmm. Like, they remembered that story. They had, the nephew had been there, but they, for some reason, didn't consider the documents she had left to be valuable enough to keep. And so that's all lost to history. So as to what else she might have had, Any other writing she might have had outside of what we have at this point is lost to history.
And that is, I think, an important part of this story, because we don't have any letters from Arthur back to Julia Sand. We know, because she mentions it in one of her own letters, that he visited her while he was president in New York City, which I think is a pretty strong acknowledgement that she wasn't just sort of writing letters into the void that a White House secretary was throwing in the trash. Yeah,
which she did wonder in her letters for a while, is because he never was writing back, she did wonder, are you even reading these? Are you just throwing these away? But he did come to visit her and her family about a year into his presidency, a little bit less than a year. And again, like I mentioned, her nephew had been there and spoke with Chester Arthur III in the late 30s, confirming that this all happened. So it's not just Julia Sand writing wishful thinking in a couple of the letters, but because of that, like, she does give the details of how these interactions went in letters 16 and 17.
And it's also interesting, the sort of boldness of it, I think, which I've always found, since this project started, I found interesting, and how there's also for letters that are about, like, sort of politics and public policy issues, there's a surprisingly broad emotional range where at certain times she's hectoring him, other times she's warmly encouraging him. Sometimes she seems kind of like his mother. Sometimes she seems almost like she's got a crush on him. And so there's a lot going on there, right? All channeled through her attempt to encourage him to do good things as president. It's tough. It's tough to think of any real comparison, right, in American history to this kind of interesting little interaction.
Yeah, I mean, I've asked different historians, can you think of anything connected to this that's like this? The closest I think has been mentioned is the girl who wrote to Abraham Lincoln suggesting you should grow a beard, which is interesting. But it's definitely, there's a bit of a gap between these two stories as well.
Well, the film is fascinating.
Thank you.
And you can definitely tell it is a labor of love. And I just want to mention, when we had the film premiere, you had a couple of people join you for a Q&A session afterwards, both of whom I think gave some fascinating remarks. And they were, both of those people, contributed somewhat to the film itself. Tell us about who those two people are.
Yeah, so one of those people, Scott Greenberger, who is the author of the, I'd say, most prestigious Chester Arthur biography of the 21st century. And the other person is Dr. Michelle Crowell, who is part of the manuscript division at the Library of Congress and oversees Reconstruction, Civil War era, and oversees all the documents of presidents from Polk through Teddy Roosevelt, which would include the letters and documents of Chester Arthur. So she, among many other things, she is the keeper of Julia Sand's letters.
So if you are a post-Civil War history researcher, you can request to see the letters in person, because they're still there, preserved for posterity.
They are, and they're also they also have those scanned within the past few years on the Library of Congress website as well. But I was as to Michelle's knowledge, I'm the first person to have gotten video footage of those letters. So that was kind of a cool first.
Yes, like we said, you can look at the scans online, and if you're one of those newfangled youngsters who doesn't read script handwriting, there's also a print text version, modern text version as well. So this is an exciting start, but like a lot of documentaries, they have a long road with screenings, reviews, film festivals, all things like that. So where are you going to shepherd your new creation?
So beginning on May 7th, the film will be available on the streaming platform called Salem Now, both for subscription as well as for rent. And then it'll be in some film festivals over the summer. First up will be the Anthem Libertarian Film Festival in Palm Springs, California. which will be on June 11th. And then we'll have some more screenings and some more availability online in the time coming after that. But those are the upcoming ways to be able to view the film. And you can go to the website cei.org/dear-mister, just the initials MR, dear-mister-president. And you can see the trailer, you can see information about the film. We'll have a link for seeing the film on Salem Now. And we'll also have a link there where you can go and read the letters, the transcriptions of these 23 letters for yourself.
All right. You can also just go to cei.org and scroll to the bottom of the page.
You can do that too.
All right. Destry, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, thank you for having me on the side of the camera.